On this episode of NES Works Gaiden, we complete our survey of the 7 games that launched alongside the Atari 7800 in May 1986, and move along to its first post-launch release. This may surprise you, but they're all arcade conversions, and they're all pretty good. We begin with Asteroids, which is surprisingly the first 7800 game we've seen to have come from Atari. In fact, technically, it's the only Atari-developed game to have shown up at the 7800's launch.
Asteroids has always been a tricky one. It's a game whose highly specific arcade hardware configuration doesn't do its golden age home adaptations any favor, and whose visuals can only really properly be simulated, if not exactly reproduced, with modern high-definition technology. The original Asteroids, of course, was one of the numerous vector-based games Atari produced for arcades in the early 80s. As with Tempest and Star Wars, Asteroids eschewed traditional dot-art bitmap images and sprites in favor of lines plotted between pinpoint dots. These games had a striking, luminous appearance in arcades. The stark, intense light of the razor-thin lines glowing against the deep black of the monitor background looked like nothing else in arcades at the time. As much as pixel-based games like Pac-Man and Tron were defined by the phosphorescent glow of their bitmaps on a field of black, Atari's vector games went a step beyond. Needless to say, this visual aesthetic didn't translate terribly well to underpowered home consoles running on standard televisions, which is to say, raster monitors. Atari's home programmers put together some fine console and computer interpretations of the game given the limitations they had to work within, but Asteroids for Atari 2600 wasn't a patch on Asteroids in the arcade. With Atari 7800, the gulf between console and arcade, well, it didn't precisely grow smaller. The 7800 still couldn't output vector graphics, but what it could do was churn a lot of fairly detailed sprites around the screen, and that's what you get here. Asteroids for 7800 drops the stark vector precision of the arcade game in favor of detailed sprites that project the illusion of three-dimensionally modeled rocks flying through space. What it lacks in luminous brilliance, it makes up for with detail, and it doesn't compromise the hectic nature of the action. As in arcades, you control a small space fighter caught in a field of asteroids hurtling about the screen. The slightest collision with a cosmic rock will detonate your ship, so you need to give them a wide berth. This is not simply a game about evasion, however. The longer you sit around in a given round of action, the more aggressively you'll be harassed by small flying saucers that zip across the screen, firing ever more accurately in your direction. Rather, your goal is to clear the screen of all asteroids by firing at them. Each time you hit an asteroid, however, it splinters into smaller fragments that go spinning away from the point of impact. Firing indiscriminately in asteroids is even more dangerous than not firing at all, since you can easily turn a single giant space boulder into half a dozen smaller space pebbles that can still inflict fatal damage to your ship. To make things even more unpredictable, the edges of the screen wrap around, meaning that when a rock flies off one side of the screen, it'll appear on the opposite side, moving at the same rate and angle. On top of that, your ship makes use of semi-realistic zero-friction physics, inherited from the first game produced by Atari founder Nolan Bushnell, Computer Space. Your controls are limited to firing, rotating left or right, and unpredictable emergency warp and thrust. The more energy you pour into your thrust, the faster you move forward, and you don't stop moving in that direction until you hit something or fire your thruster in a different direction. The sheer number of moving objects on the screen, along with their tendency to fragment into tiny pieces, combine with your extremely restrictive control mechanics to make for a game whose challenge is inherent to its limitations. Asteroids' galactic sandbox doesn't contain a lot of different objects or options, but what is there demands quick reflexes, careful planning, and a keen awareness of how your tiny ship maneuvers through the void. The 7800 handles the entire game with grace, suffering from no evident slowdown or flicker no matter how many objects appear on screen at once. The only real shortcoming to this version is that the console's stingy resolution makes for some very unfriendly collision detection. Your ship's hitbox feels noticeably larger than it probably would on NES or Master System, given how little pixel information there is for the console to work with. This is all theoretical, of course, because the NES and Master System never got Asteroids. That one hang-up aside, it's easily the best home conversion of Asteroids to have appeared in 1986. Though, as I said repeatedly throughout the previous episode, it's hard to say just how compelling the best version of a game from 1980 was when the alternative was Excitebike or Mach Rider or Super Mario Bros.
On the other hand, the 7800's other Atari conversion at launch presented a strong case for the system back when it debuted. And actually, 30 years later, it still makes a compelling argument.
Food Fight may not have been an arcade hit on the level of Asteroids or Ms. Pac-Man, but it's an addictive, single-screen game that has never been revisited since this 1986 release, which makes the 7800 port pretty appealing. Food Fight may have been distributed in arcades by Atari, but it wasn't actually created by the company. Rather, it had been designed and programmed by General Computing Corp, the same studio responsible for hacking the Pac-Man ROM into the superior Ms. Pac-Man. More relevantly, GCC also designed the 7800 hardware. They also reportedly programmed all the 7800's launch games. This likely accounts for why those games were all so good. They were handled by a talented team who knew the hardware inside and out. By some accounts, GCC turned around some of these conversions in less than a month apiece, a ridiculously slim development window given how well they turned out. Food Fight might be the best of them, right up there alongside Ms. Pac-Man and Joust. Of course, 2 of those 3 games were originally created by GCC, so it's probably only natural they'd have been given preferential treatment. It's hard to fault GCC for playing favorites though, especially when the results were this good. Food Fight is your quintessential golden era arcade game. Single screen, limited objectives and capabilities, constantly ratcheting up its intensity, featuring a few little grace notes that set it apart from other games. It has all the hallmarks of an arcade classic, really. It is, perhaps not surprisingly, a game about eating. It's hard to explain these days just how massive an impact Pac-Man had on game design when it arrived toward the end of 1980, but consider this. Before Pac-Man, just about any arcade game that wasn't based on real-world sports or racing more or less limited you to a single verb, shoot. You shot submarines, evil cowboys, and lots of space invaders. Sure, there were exceptions where you worked with a different verb like Hey Yankyo Alien and Dig, but the vast majority of vintage arcade titles were just about shooting things. Pac-Man introduced the idea of eating, and suddenly games became about consuming food. Even games that had nothing to do with eating were branded as such, as seen with the bizarre box copy for Dig Dug on 7800. Food Fight, however, embraced both verbs. It was a game whose goal was eating, but whose mechanics also involved shooting. Well, throwing. It is, after all, called Food Fight. Here's the premise. You play a child who wants to eat an ice cream cone. Said dairy confection appears on the opposite side of the screen from your starting point. Eating the cone is as simple as trekking across the screen, whereupon the lad devours the object of his gustatory affection with an absolutely alarming skull-splitting animation. But because this is a video game, nothing is ever simple. There is conflict involved in this process. Specifically, an infinite array of diminutive chefs aim to put a stop to your dessert ambitions. If they catch you, or if you fall into one of the holes they appear out of, you are denied your dreams of Rocky Road. Worse, if you take too long to reach the cone, the ice cream will melt away to nothing, and you'll receive no treats as a reward. Fortunately, in between you and the ice cream, you'll find heaping piles of food. Pies, tomatoes, watermelons, and more. These become your ammunition. When you pass over a pile of food, you pick up an item from the stack and can fling it at a chef. Land a successful hit and that chef will go skittering away, giving you a second or two of respite before another chef zips out of one of the manholes. So the game becomes a tactical race from one pile to another, snatching snacks and tossing them back at marauding cooks. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but it's fun. You move at a decent clip and can chuck food in all directions. Each type of food has its own distinct properties. Tomatoes, for example, are fast and fly a long way, while peas have a shorter range but fan out like a shotgun blast. Complicating things is the fact that the chefs can also pick up and throw food after a round or two of action, meaning you have to play defensively as much as you remain on the offense. It's a fast-paced, madcap game, and there are several extra features, including the game's ability to recognize when you've narrowly dodged disaster and reward you with a slow-motion instant replay of that round to keep things interesting. Food Fight plays perfectly on 7800, which is no mean feat. The arcade game featured a rotary controller similar to the one SNK would use on Ikari Warriors a few years later, allowing you to move and fire independently with uncanny precision. Despite being limited to a standard digital joystick, Food Fight on 7800 doesn't feel limited or hampered. It plays smoothly and never loses its energetic appeal. As with most of the other games we've seen on 7800, this version includes several difficulty levels. The most basic mode robs the enemy chefs of their ability to collect and throw food, while the most advanced mode, Challenge, gives you a single life and challenges you to survive as long as possible. Even on its most difficult setting though, Food Fight feels remarkably forgiving for an arcade game of this vintage. Rather than destroying players immediately, it ramps up difficulty slowly enough to give you a feel for the action and to allow you to see more than a stage or two. It's a great conversion of a great game, and given how rarely it's appeared since then, the 7800 adaptation still stands out as a remarkable and desirable release.
Also notable is the 7800 adaptation of Robotron 2084, though by no means does this game offer the same level of gentle kindness we saw with Food Fight. Robotron 2084 was ball-kickingly hard in arcades, and it's ball-kickingly hard here on 7800.
Much as with Food Fight, Robotron 2084 made use of an unusual control setup in arcades. A dual joystick design that allowed players to move their character with one stick and fire independently in all directions with the other. That is to say, it was the first twin-stick shooter. The 7800 couldn't replicate Food Fight's rotary stick, but the dual stick design of Robotron? That was an entirely realistic proposition. The console shipped with two joysticks after all, and Robotron on 7800 allowed players to plug both sticks into the system and use them in tandem to battle through throngs of deadly robots. There are even aftermarket gadgets designed to hold both controllers at once, securing them together to create a true twin-stick experience. Which is to say, Robotron 2084 for Atari 7800 might be the single best console conversion of the game ever in terms of playability, at least until Midway Arcade Treasures for PlayStation 2, GameCube, and Xbox came along, 17 years after the 7800 version. Even the PlayStation 1 and Saturn compilations, which included faithful arcade ports, predated those systems' twin analog controllers and forced players to hump it with imperfect solutions. Of course, you can also play this version of Robotron 2084 with a single stick, but it's much more difficult that way. In order to fire, you need to press the fire button while simultaneously moving the stick in the direction you want to fire. The joy of Robotron's original design was that it allowed you to move and fire independently, an essential consideration when you're being swarmed by dozens of enemy robots at a time. Moving away from a fast-attacking robot while firing backward at it makes for a much more survivable experience than dashing at the killer robot while shooting. Robotron 2084 is a blazingly fast game, and it's incredibly challenging. You know how they say the ideal arcade quarter drop rate was once every 3 minutes? You have to be a gaming savant to survive 3 minutes of Robotron 2084, which designer Eugene Jarvis built to be every bit as intense and unforgiving as his previous hit, Defender. You play as a lone hero surrounded by swarms of killer robots and a handful of human survivors. Your goal is ostensibly to save the humans by making contact with them before they're crushed by the Hulk-sized robots, but really your mission is just to avoid dying for as long as possible. Once you clear out all the robots from around, you move along to an even more challenging stage. The robots evolve in complexity and ferocity, quickly adopting new tactics like multiplying as they emerge from portals, or firing seemingly inescapable energy beams at you. It's a pure adrenaline rush, and the 7800 version recaptures the intensity of the arcade game perfectly. The one area in which it falls short is its visuals, unsurprisingly. The arcade game featured high-res visuals, while the 7800 was obviously far more limited. The solution developer GCC went with was to decrease the resolution and detail of the individual sprites without reducing their numbers or behavior. Robotron 2084 on 7800 features just as much happening on screen at once as the arcade game did, albeit at a lower resolution. An impressive feat for the hardware. At the risk of sounding like a broken record here, Robotron 2084 is another arcade port that would have been sizzling hot had the 7800 shipped as planned, but whose shine had faded by 1986. Don't hold that against this cartridge though, it's the way to play Robotron on a classic console.
And finally, we wrap up this episode with the first 7800 game to have arrived after the initial wave of launch games. Though I hesitate to call this part of a second wave, because this was it. August 1986 brought us a single game, Galaga, another Namco coin-op conversion courtesy of GCC.
As with the other Namco conversions we've seen for 7800, this take on Galaga easily surpasses anything available on other consoles in the US at the time. It moves quickly and smoothly and carries forward all the familiar features of the arcade game. But as with Dig Dug, it doesn't compare favorably to the Famicom version that was already out in Japan, courtesy of Namco themselves. That didn't really matter for Dig Dug since the Famicom version never came to the US, and the 7800 had so little presence in Japan as to not matter. There was no real overlap between the game's two versions. Galaga, on the other hand, would eventually make its way to the US on NES, courtesy of Namco's future spouse, Bandai. The 7800 had about a 2-year lead on that version, which certainly worked in its favor at the time, but in retrospect there's very little reason to go back to this slightly worse adaptation when the NES port is right there. Not to mention so readily accessible, having been regurgitated on everything from Virtual Console to standalone keychain mini arcade devices. The biggest shortcoming with the 7800 rendition of Galaga isn't so much a flaw in the game or programming as a side effect of the hardware. The relatively low pixel resolution of the Atari 7800 means this interpretation of the arcade game doesn't come close to directly rendering the coin-op's visuals. I find myself having a far more difficult time lining up and landing shots against oncoming waves of enemies here than on NES or in arcades. Some of that has to do with the slightly inaccurate enemy patterns and behavior, but mostly it comes down to the fact that the balletic precision that makes the original game so engrossing isn't entirely possible here. Galaga rates your accuracy at the end of each session, and I can never seem to crack 50% on the 7800 version. By comparison, I consistently score in the mid to upper 60s on NES and in arcades, so it's not just my imagination. But I readily admit this may be one of those cases where I've played the original arcade game so much that I'm having trouble appreciating what is a very good conversion due to what amounts to relatively minor inconsistencies. Galaga is an all-time classic, and while the 7800 port doesn't nail it 100%, it's still a damn good and damn replayable recreation of the coin-op version. Aside from the pixel wonkiness, Galaga works exactly like you'd expect. The game plays across rounds, where a fleet of alien insects streams onto the screen in waves before taking their Space Invaders positions at the top of the screen. Once the entire armada has made its entrance, individual bugs peel away from the formation to harry the player with a variety of dive-bombing patterns. The further you advance into the game, the more aggressive the aliens become, firing at the player as they circulate onto the screen, and eventually breaking from the inbound formations to take out the player immediately. Every few rounds, you have an opportunity to take out a 40-ship formation of non-hostile foes for bonus points. And in time, certain enemies will transform and multiply to swoop down in a special bonus formation. The real stars of the show, of course, are the gray flagships. These enemies take 2 hits to destroy rather than 1, and they frequently form up with subordinate foes to attack in a 3-ship pattern. The flagships will also swoop down alone to attempt to capture the player's ship with a tractor beam. If you allow yourself to be captured, you'll lose that ship, but if you manage to take out your fighter's captor on its next bombing run, you'll reclaim the fighter and dock with it, doubling your firepower, but also doubling the size of your hitbox. There's a lot of risk-reward strategy that emerges from this minor feature, and it makes for a really engrossing game. And all of that is here and present in Galaga for 7800. Despite my reservations about the total fidelity of this conversion, it's a great interpretation of a classic. Again, had the 7800 launched as planned in 1984, arcade renditions like this would have made it the console to have. In the summer of 1986, though, it was up against an impressive and diverse lineup from Nintendo, with a massive launch for Sega's new console lurking in the wings, making 7800 a tough sell. A system lost in time.
Next time on NES Works Gaiden, we wrap up the 7800's release lineup for 1986 and 1987. What can I say? It was a rough start.